Adolescence is not only a time of instability, but it's also a time of intensity. When adolescents love, they really love. When they hate, they really hate. When they're sad, they're really sad. When they're happy, they're really happy. So everything is really, really, really intense. And that puts a lot of pressure existentially. Adolescence, this is the time we start to question everything. Who are we? Where are we? Where is our home? What is this big universe and cosmos? What is this weird thing called life and conscious? We lack a cultural grammar and framework to address these existential questions. They are in this weird limbo. They fail to properly address these existential questions that they're having. What then crawls in is meaninglessness because they're bereft of that. This makes adolescence and working with teenagers often so challenging for people.
Welcome to the Mindform podcast, where we delve into the minds of some of the most interesting people on the planet, discuss psychology, philosophy, and personal growth, and share the wisdom we uncover with you. Join us as we explore the art of forming our minds. Here's your host, Frank Lawton.
Kia ora from New Zealand. Welcome to the Mindform podcast, an extension of the Mindform collective and training platform. This podcast is similarly a space dedicated to exploring and altering psychological landscapes together. In each weekly episode, I speak with a member of Mindform to extract wisdom, refine ideas, and collaborate on the game of architecting our minds. This week's guest is Kasra Mirzaie. Kasra is a licensed psychotherapist, a researcher, and a lecturer at Hildesheim University in Germany. He is co-founder of the Global Youth Network, which supports adolescents and their support systems, and of the K7 Institute for Counseling, Research, Training, and Networking, which develops tools for meaning, connectedness, and wisdom. Both of these institutes utilize the internal family systems framework. His core foci in his professional life are emotional regulation in adolescence and the science of meaning and spirituality. Welcome to the Mindform podcast, Kasra.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure. I'll just start with, how are you today? What's alive in you?
Oh, yeah, I'm good. I was actually quite stoked and was looking forward to this conversation today. And I think these are always beautiful opportunities to dialogue. So I am a little bit tired because the gardener was a little bit loud, so I had a little less sleep than usual. But overall, I'm doing fine. Thank you. What about you?
I don't get asked often. No, I'm great. What's alive in me is, yeah, just this. It's the end of my day here in New Zealand. I know it's 10 a.m. for you, but it's 8 p.m. for me. So everything's done. I've just got this left, and I enjoy chatting to interesting people. So I'm just feeling calm and enthusiastic at the same time.
Nice.
So I want to start with, I want to get into your work and your work with adolescents and with meaning, but I'm curious initially about you. So could you tell us a bit about your journey? Like, what are some of the key experiences or learnings that have led you to doing what you do today? Your interest in the science of spirituality and meaningfulness, internal family systems, etc.
Yeah, I really like the question. I guess as with many things, I need to start in my childhood, probably. I would say, I always had a deep sense of curiosity and wonder inside of me, and as well as a hunger for knowledge. So I was always called, as a child, always called like the curious Kasra, and because I was so nosy, and I also loved reading like encyclopedias. Like, what child does read stuff like that instead of playing video games? But anyways, I think I was always fascinated by the human condition and also human behavior, why people behave the way they behave, why they are the way they are, and why they think and feel the way they do. And I would say that that's the overarching theme or the through line of my biography. And I think another thing to add on to that is, I think I was always surrounded by love and laughter. like even in the midst of uncertainty and pain and suffering, which there was quite a lot of in my childhood. But I still was surrounded. I always felt surrounded by beauty and aesthetics, and especially in form of music. In my family, poetry, arts, knowledge. And I guess that's part of my cultural heritage as an Iranian. I think that's part and parcel of being an Iranian in a way. It's yeah, very poetic culture. And on top of having, these things also have their dark sides, but we don't have to go there right now. I guess that's where it comes from. And I wanted to be a musician at first. And although my brothers and I were able to do it professionally and earn money, for me, it didn't fulfill my career path. It wasn't fulfilling to me in a way. And I guess for various reasons, probably reasons and events that tainted my relationship towards, not towards music as such, but towards music as a vocation. And then I became a high school teacher. And as a high school teacher, I was very quickly, I've experienced very quickly being overwhelmed by the school dynamics and systems. And I think part of it really has to do with the structure of the school system and educational system and culture.
Mm.
But a huge chunk of it was also my immaturity. I didn't have a lot of experience. I was young, I was naive, and I didn't really have apprenticeship or mentoring. And well, I wanted to understand my students better back then. And so I focused more technically on psychology, like deeply more with theories and research. And so then I was really lucky, and I really mean it. I was really lucky to meet my mentor, and learned from a lot and still learning from. And it's Ann-Kathrin Bockmann, and she's now my dear friend and colleague, which I share the K7 practice with. So that was really, really valuable for me to meet that person. I don't think that was coincidence. It really was, being in the right place at the right time. And I think I was lucky, and that shifted my entire life. And retrospectively, I would say, and I know this sounds very new agey, but I will say it anyways. I think that this path has chosen me in a sense. What I first believed to be a way to understand my outer world better turned to be the biggest self experience of my life, ongoing, still continuing. And now I believe I embarked on this psycho spiritual journey to understand myself better, to heal myself, and to connect with my inside, with the sacred, and to explore my inner world and be a facilitator of everything that promotes life. So that would be my answer, Frank.
Awesome. Beautiful. I always hope that people answer that question with the whole story. So I'm glad you did. I've lightly, I suppose, just from encountering stories and reading them, explored Iranian culture and the history there. And, obviously every culture is diverse and complex, but yes, I know there is a deep and very old history of poetry and intellectualism, this kind of, this deep intersection between intellectualism and art in Iranian culture. And obviously there's some sad stuff about political things that have happened in more recent times that have done damage to that beautiful piece of that culture. But yeah, it's very cool. It's very cool. There's this one, don't you have this one big like poetry book that tells like this whole long sort of mythical story? Yeah. What's that
It's
called?
called Shahnameh. It's like the letters from the king.
Yeah.
That's the biggest epic of humankind. Actually, it was written by Ferdowsi, I think over a span of 40 years, something like that. So he basically dedicated his entire life to that epic. Yeah.
Truly epic. Yeah. I explored a little bit of that. I was blown away.
Oh.
Yeah, and I can kind of relate to your experience of, I think, being a young person, especially a young person who likes to problem solve, who is curious and empathetic and inexperienced, in a role where you're trying to support young people or vulnerable people. Um,
Mm.
when you don't have all the tools at your disposal, it can be really, I guess, burnout. It can be a bit disabling because you come in every day with hope and curiosity. Maybe this is going to work. Maybe this is going to work. But yeah, it's a challenge, and you don't know how to hold space or a bit of distance, and you don't
Yeah.
have someone presenting you with the strategies. And I'm stoked that you were able to find curiosity of psychology, etc., to take a new approach, and that you were able to find a mentor over this journey. Well, here, let me paint a picture. I like to do this with some of our guests. So
Sure.
consider a map and a landscape. So the landscape is your journey through life, going from where you've been to where you are, the different careers, the different interests, etc. And the map represents your beliefs and the goals with which you navigate, right? So that's how you
Mm.
represent everything you've been in. It's the way that you interpret your world. On the journey you've been on, you've updated your map a number of times, I imagine. So what are the two most substantial revisions you've made to this map, i.e. the most important shifts in your perspective you've had in the last sort of 5 years as you've explored these
Yeah.
interests?
Yeah. I love that question. I would say one major shift or transition and transformation has been shifting from harshness to more softer relationality to myself and the world. The value of lightness and playfulness, and to counterbalance all the depth and profundity of life, that to me was one of the biggest insights I had. And um, to understand that never trust someone who hasn't experienced not only grief, but joy as well.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand that ultimately healing is when it's not displayed or embodied or enacted in a joyful way, in a light way, then maybe it's no good. Maybe it's not the right path of healing. And I would
Mm,
say really the shift from strength and hardship into more into softness and gentleness, I think has been one of the greatest shifts in my life. Now, the other one I would say has been to have courage to face myself. And by that I mean to really accept where I'm coming from, who I am, and not to be ashamed of what I can bring to the table and into the world. Um, I think, I guess, due to uncertainty and those um, early life events, I often had the sense of, well, can I really contribute to the world with all my talents? And I guess I was insecure in that manner, although part of me actually was able to be extroverted and, step into the world and do my thing. But um, I would now encourage my younger self to be even more accepting of who I am and to be courageous and not so much be led by fear and actually be really, well, in IFS, you would say self-led, to be self-led and to be led by courage. And I think, yeah, embodying that more and more has been another major insight and shift in my life. I hope that
beautiful.
answers your question.
It does. I see a thread as well, a common thread between those 2 points, which is, and I think this is a journey a lot of us, I wish more people go on as we reflect on ourselves and we think intentionally about this stuff. And I certainly think a spiritual dimension to it can really help, some way to get you out of your head. But it's this shift from seeing the goal, the outcome for yourself to be as becoming correct or not
Yeah.
being wrong anymore, right? And shifting from that, shifting out of that whole view of, am I right or wrong? Am I good or bad? Not even asking that question, but, oh, this is me. What do I value? And where am I going to go from there? And because I think often, when you say the having this goal of lightness and play,
Yeah.
I think so often this is me when I was younger, and I'm in this journey shifting out of it. When I imagine, oh, what do I want to be when I've improved myself, when I've healed myself? It's some external impression, it's something. It's high performance. It's success.
Yeah.
It's it's not making mistakes. It's having the correct body, the correct thoughts, the correct actions, whatever that would be. Um, and yeah, I think that's definitely a sign of real healing, is shifting out of that need to be something at all. And then from that comes the freedom to go, oh, well, what actually do I want? What actually do I value? How am I really feeling? I'm fine with whatever that is, because that's leading me, not some concept, not some standard, right? So that's a
Yeah.
beautiful journey, man.
No, thank you. I totally agree. I would say often in my experience, what is driving that, um, let's say, status behavior is basically just a basic need to fit in and to belong. And but honoring that, like, intentionally or consciously, often creates vulnerabilities. And I think young people often feel intimidated by it. And because we also lack the role models that show us that vulnerability is okay, or that there are ways to be with that vulnerability in a wise way. So yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, and
Yeah,
I
well,
would say my worldview shifted from a place where I thought that life is conflict and battle towards, well, life can be a gift. Life can be, it's about connectedness and participation in life and facilitating life. And I think that shift was hugely impactful and still is, continues to be.
yeah, it's a complete shift. You wake up with a different idea of what you're meant to be doing today, what it's about. Well, you kind of set up a great segue, because I'm very curious about your work with adolescents, with young people.
Sure.
Um, yeah, there's that need to belong, and that can present a huge barrier for young people for connection, etc. It can lead to a lot of status behaviors that sometimes young people can be destructive to themselves or others. I'm curious how you bring, you talk about the solution to this partly being, um, becoming centered in self, and that
Mhm.
IFS concept of self. So maybe you could tell us a little bit of what, just for the audience, the IFS framework and what the self is in that.
Yeah.
And then maybe you could speak to how you bring that framework to adolescents and their unique challenges.
Yeah, sure. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially maybe for the audience, part of the audience that might not know what IFS is. So IFS is called is the abbreviation for internal family systems, which is basically a psychotherapeutic model developed by Richard Schwartz, I think in the 80s. And it basically is mm, the idea behind IFS is that the psyche is multiple. That it is implicit and explicit, I would say. It's the multiplicity of the psyche is what makes this model what it is, and which means that it's a therapeutic model to do parts work, like the various parts of ourselves. Now, it's I think the idiosyncratic thing about IFS is that there is something beyond parts, which IFS calls self with a capital S, and are really not trying to go here into all the philosophy and psychology of what the self is, because that's really complicated. I don't know, like 5,000 years of history. So I just want to briefly say what IFS thinks self is. Basically, I would say, in my words, it's a space where parts meet it's a qualitative space, and it's something that is not a part. I would say it's a quality or different qualities, and they are often you can often recognize them using these C words, like when you feel curious, when you feel calm, when you feel connected or courageous or creative or confident. And these are basically the self qualities and are compassionate as well, where when we start to meet parts from that space, the quality and dynamics of those internal relationships, they start to shift. So it's a vertical approach that also has an horizontal outcome. So basically, the idea of IFS and parts work is when we start to make sense of our own inner dynamics, which obviously influences outer dynamics, we can then step into relationships differently. And we can, well, not only change and understand our behaviors, but connect better to the world. So it's not just an horizontal, it's not just a vertical model, which often people think, but there's this huge horizontal dimension to IFS as well.
Okay,
So
just for clarity, so when you say vertical, do you sort of mean through the layers of self, and then horizontal means between people, right? Just
yes,
to clarify.
yes, exactly.
Yeah,
I think they're different. I mean, they're different horizontals. You can also internally have horizontal relationships, like parts to parts. But
right.
yeah, I mean those layers of the psyche and self and the inner world that we encounter. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Just to really clarify the picture, could you maybe, it can
Right.
be a real example or a hypothetical example, that's fine either way, but an example of I guess an inner dynamic, an internal family system. So
Yeah,
two parts and how they relate, and then how the self would come in and
sure.
resolve that or participate in that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That I think that makes a lot of sense for people to grasp the model a little bit better. Um, let's take let's take one of my adolescent clients, or like many of my adolescent clients. I've worked in a residential crisis center with adolescents being from 14 to 18 years old, and um, adolescents who basically engaged in self-injury, self-harm, addiction, basically were traumatized as the root cause, like attachment traumas. And a very, very typical dynamic or pattern was with regards to self-injury. Now, when I work with my clients and we did IFS, addressing self-injury from an IFS lens, what we then often encountered were, well, there was at the beginning a very vulnerable part that felt triggered and abandoned. And as the reaction, another part comes in that wants to protect the system, and apart from overwhelm and basically being flooded by intensity and emotion, and these parts often, because of the immediacy of this very intense moment, they become quite myopic. So they have this motto. They say, no matter what, we want this pain to stop now,
Mm-hmm.
and even if it means to cut myself to just relieve some tension, right? So then a part comes in that really, really is able to fight these emotional flames. And then as a reaction to that part, another part comes in and says, "Oh, you knew better. You've been," and this is exactly the language that they're using, Frank, and I'm not joking. They say, "You've been clean for 7 weeks. Oh, you know better. You know you shouldn't cut yourself. Why are you doing this? You're stupid. You're stupid. You will never be loved." And this inner critic then becomes basically self-loathing, which then you can, I mean, it's from now it's pretty obvious what happens. Again, the very young and vulnerable part gets triggered again, right? Because this is a relational rupture. It feels
Yeah.
abandoned. Those emotional flames come up. Then you again engage in myopic behavior just to really extinguish these fires. And then the critic comes again. And then you have this vicious cycle. And the this is like a typical example of an internal relational dynamics of parts. Now, where self comes in is when you really, really get the opportunity to work with those parts and to meet them not from this confrontational, judgmental space, but to really become curious about their raison d'etre, like their validity. Why is the part the way it is? Why does the part do its job the way it does, and to really, really acknowledge that, and to be, I would say, if you understand that there are relevant functions that these parts are, having and fulfilling, you then can become compassionate about them. You really can understand them better, and then you can build up a relation towards them. And this is what you would call when self comes in. It's a weird kind of language, and I don't like the idea of a self coming in, but I think it's meeting these parts from a different space or with different qualities. I think that captures it better.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. What it reminds me of is what you spoke to earlier, of an approach of softness, right?
Yes,
Because
exactly.
that judgment, and it's so hard to imagine. Well, I remember, again, I've been on a similar journey, moving out of self perfectionism, and I'm not all the way
Yeah,
out, but self judgment and all of that. And in hindsight, you can really see the emotional dynamics there, and that actually this emotional state and this orientation and this perceptual mode of judgment and criticism,
yeah,
it perpetuates. It actually it's a necessary part of the cycle. And in terms of this dynamic of protecting yourself with some harmful behavior, being violent towards yourself in response to that, and protecting yourself from that violence with harmful behavior, around and around you go. But when you stop that judgment piece and you just come in with empathy, with softness, even just with patience, like, oh, it is what it is, um, that just then that cycle can't perpetuate in the same way. I think people at the service level, they spend a lot of time and they put a lot of work into all sorts of different strategies and approaches, and a lot of them are not very gentle, to becoming the people they want to be, or stopping the behaviors they want to stop, or starting the behaviors they want to start,
yeah,
whatever it is. And I've realized recently just the power of calmness, like just choosing that over getting it right, and then suddenly I'm in this position of being a bit more resourced and being a bit less
yeah,
terrified, such that I'm less likely to be taken over by these
yeah.
anxious automatic self-defense strategies when times get tough.
Absolutely. And I think being self-led means to be adaptive and to be attuned, because sometimes there are situations where maybe the situation affords us not to be calm, right? But to act in a certain way that feels right and fitted to the situation. And I would say
Mm,
this is still self-led, even if we are not calm. But I would say I totally agree. You can do that with a calm assertiveness and still be clear. And clarity is one of those self qualities, one of the 8 C's. And and I agree. I think the aspect of gentleness is really important. I will just give another example of one of my clients
please.
at this at the psychiatric ward I worked in. So basically, the concept of that ward and station that I worked in was dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, which I guess many people know, especially from the audience. So it's a behavioral therapy, but I think there is a lot of wisdom to DBT. Now, one of the major issues, however, was when my clients got those DBT diary cards, they're called, where you basically track and journal, and there are scaling questions and from 0 to 5, and just to rate and see how things are. And also on the diary cards, there are also the goals written that you want to achieve in the therapy, blah blah blah. Now, one of those lines on those diary cards was called problem behavior. And often clinicians expect the clients to write down something like self-injury. Now, I had one of my clients who was who had a part who was obviously engaging in self-injury, but was deeply offended by that being called a problem behavior. And that part, when we're able to work with that part, and I basically interviewed that part and became curious around that part, it got really clear that that was really invalidating. And then the part said something like, well, you might think that this is the problem, but I'd rather have myself being cut than to be death, because the next step would be suicide. So understanding that this was life-saving behavior really shifted the inner system towards more understanding and compassion. So that's one of these examples how really the gentleness and the softness really can transform and have a transformative momentum.
Yeah, it shows you that I see this. You say the self has compassion and the self is curious, and you can see the similarity between those things. You come into whether you're judging yourself or in this case, perhaps the way that therapists were judging their young clients with an idea of, okay, this is the way things should be, and I'm comparing that to the way things are, and then how do we make a
Yeah,
change? When you come
yeah,
in with that preset idea instead of, oh, this is interesting. Why is this happening? What's the cause? What's the rationale? What's the justification? What's it like
mm,
to be in that perspective? Um, yeah, that's both compassionate and curious. They're very similar things.
exactly. And while being quite clear on certain things, like having
Mm.
understanding for the needs, but absolutely being clear that not every behavior is acceptable. And I think this is
Yeah, yeah.
often what people confuse when it comes to compassion. They think it's accepting every kind of bullshit. That doesn't mean that. It means really following truth and reality. And that's a different kind of approach to compassion, I would say.
Yeah, well, as a parent, you certainly have to master that art
Oh yeah,
of
we all do.
validating, empathizing, but I'm not going to let you do that.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's a field of tension that we're really in. So, and it's not an easy task, and I really have a lot of empathy for all those support systems of adolescents. It's a hard job. I mean, it's a hard time to be a teenager. So, yeah, kudos to all those teenagers and their parents and support system.
Yeah. So in your work with young people, what are what's your perception of what the challenges are of being young? I mean, you hear, oh, your body's changing and you're trying to find yourself, and that's all true. I wouldn't discount those answers, but
Yeah,
yeah, I'm curious your perspective of what the unique challenges are there, and
yeah.
also what are the needs that adolescents have that are salient to them that they're trying to meet with all of this, whatever it is that you know problem quote unquote
Yeah.
behaviors that they're doing. What are the needs?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I would say the challenges are that this is a time in life that is very idiosyncratic. It's a unique time in life because it's a transformative experience. Adolescence is a transformative moment and experience. And I think people can do a lot of things wrong, and we can shift into what I think might be helpful. Um, but I think not taking serious this lived experience of adolescence is a major deal. So people either start to these aspects of lived experience from adolescence are either ignored by parents and clinicians and professionals, or they're pathologized, or they're ridiculed. And I think these are the typical three tendencies people um, orient towards. And often there is this kind of reductionism in it. We reduce adolescence to puberty and bodily changes, and then we explain it away. Oh yeah, it's just puberty. Well, yes and no. There is also more. There's this entire layer above when I mean, often in reductionism, reduce it in a downward manner, but we also have those layers above, those anthropological and cultural levels. Now, by the way, this is where, you know, knowledge about adolescence and the archetype of adolescence and the anthropology of adolescence came in handy for me
Mm.
when I was working with those parts of my teenagers. I was able to share that human history and how cultures engage, for example, in self-mutilation, right? And understanding these, for example, are aspects of human culture and history made help the parts understand themselves better and why they're engaging in these behaviors. And then it became more coherent, and there was a way to make sense and meaning out of these things, and aha moments kicked in. So I would say often this lack of knowledge of those upper levels and layers, those cultural dimensions and anthropological dimensions, It's the reducing adolescents to puberty. It's either pathologizing those behaviors, it's ignoring them, or even ridiculing them. I think these are often those, well, the way we deal with the challenges. And I would say another challenge or huge challenge, or again, part and parcel of the archetype of adolescence is not only a time of instability and and probably of necessary instability for transformation to happen, for change to happen, but it's also time of intensity. So one of the challenges and why people often struggle with working with teenagers is that everything feels intense. Like when I say everything, I mean the highs feel high and the lows feel low. When adolescents love, they really love. But when they hate, they really hate. When they're sad, they're really sad. But when they're happy, they're really happy. So everything is really, really, really intense. And that puts a lot of pressure existentially. So again, I think this is again where lightness and joy and humor came in handy in my work, is to really balance out those deep existential questions that they have with a lot of humor and joy, I would say. And I will just add another thing, Frank, if that's okay.
Of course.
This very idiosyncratic stage of life opens up adolescence obviously opens up the self towards deeper aspects of reality in human nature. Now, and this is the time of our lives where we start to question everything. Who are we? Where are we? Where is our home? What is this big universe and cosmos all about? What is this weird thing called life and consciousness? What is that? Now, and since our modern culture actually has dispensed with wisdom traditions and failed to basically guide adolescents through that transformative experience, and since we lack a cultural grammar and framework to address these existential questions and guide them through them wisely, since they are in this weird limbo and in between space, right? And since we fail to properly address these existential questions that they're having, what then crawls in is meaninglessness because they're bereft of that. And I think this makes adolescence and working with teenagers often so challenging for people. And another, I think, a very, very important thing is it also really depends on how your inner adolescent is and how you integrated your inner adolescent, if you can connect with that. And I often feel people failing working with them if they can't access their own adolescent energy. And I think that's huge as well. It's a way to relate to them.
Yeah, it was one of my first thoughts as you were telling these stories of how people fail to connect, I suppose, with adolescents when they're trying to support them. Is we go through adolescence, we experience these. I mean, we all can remember, if we try. It might take a bit of digging for some people, but just the intensity of crushes and pain and confusion and frustration and all of that in adolescence. And I think the world we could probably all remember the world ridiculing us, and then we ridicule ourselves, don't we? We go, oh, that's stupid, I just need to get over it, and we bring that same response to ourselves to young people. And I think even just hearing that from you now, that's a useful reminder, because it's very easy and culturally very, very normal to dismiss the struggles of adolescents, to ridicule adolescents. Oh, they're just emotional, they're just dramatic, they're just overreacting. And I'm curious your thoughts. You talked about pathologization. Do you would you critique young people who are feeling the emotion of anxiety or the emotion of depression? Would you critique the kind of diagnostic and then maybe chemically medical response to kids who are going through that?
Yeah, I do have appreciation, but also critique for that approach. I think it would be foolish to diminish it, or even to not take those diagnostic dimensions or the lens of pathology seriously, and there are cases where it's more a clinical pathology than just adolescence. And I think the art is in honing skills, in crafting skills to really be able to differentiate between what is like typical normative existential transformative momentum versus more a clinical pathological tendency of behaviors. But I would say medicine and clinical psychology, they tend to overemphasize symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And to suffer means to undergo. And there is necessary suffering. And necessary suffering in the sense of there is this necessity to go through transformation, and there will be a byproduct of intense emotions and intensity. Now, it's not about avoiding that transformation, but creating a container that can hold that pain and suffering and those moods and emotions. And I think there is often the very quick tendency to view expressed behaviors as a form of deviation from the norm,
Mm-hmm.
and to understand that and view it from a lens of pathology and failing again those different layers of meaning that, for example, anthropology can give us. Like, why is it that like every tribe and culture has some kind of ritual of self-mutilation? Like, if that was only pathological, that would be meaningless. Why, like even evolutionary, why is it I mean, it seems to be some kind of adaptive, there seems to be an adaptive function behind that. And we should ask these questions. And I think it's just due diligence to incorporate these different kinds of dimensions into our assessments as well.
Mm-hmm. So you understand, and I'm agreeing for sure that a lot of these struggles we see in adolescence with whether it's self-harm or just overwhelm, anxiety, whatever, and different. There are all
Yeah.
sorts of different behaviors that would lead to adolescence being in the place where they'd meet you. But you see that as at least partly a natural or worth inquiring into response to the real lived experience of how tumultuous adolescence is.
Yeah.
So much change. You're going from just riding the wave of the meaning that everyone else has built to realizing you have to figure out why that's true, and do things mean anything, and why do things mean that? And yeah, when you're not giving an answer, that's part of it, right? It's not just going through that experience, but it's going through that in a context where you can look at social media or the lack of ritual and tradition, or maybe there's all sorts of things that are different today about adolescence. I mean, people have said that teenagerhood is in some sense sort of a modern invention, this era of in
Yeah.
between time when you're no longer a child, but you don't have independence or responsibility. So there's a lot of things that are different today about adolescence. What do you see as the solution, such
Mhm.
that young people can be supported to find adaptive ways to respond to or be supported through the
Yeah.
real genuine struggle of that change? Is it
Yeah.
ritual? Do we need more self-mutilation rituals, or do we need is it the way we have conversations with kids? Is it the things we put into their lives, the opportunities?
Yeah.
What do you see as being needed?
Yeah. Excellent question. I think ritual actually is part of the answer. Now, I don't mean necessarily self-mutilation ritual.
I was just
No,
teasing.
I'm not advocating for doing that. But understanding the meaning and the need behind that, I think is important, because then we can create maybe alternative practices and actions and behaviors that can still lead us to the same and fulfill the same needs and fulfill the same function. I would say so. First of all, um, adolescents have a need to contribute. So what is needed is giving them a chance and opportunity to contribute. And most of the movements we see nowadays are driven by adolescent behaviors. Let's take Fridays for Future, for example, or let's even take those very brave Iranian teenagers that started protesting because of that frustration that they're experiencing. This is all Gen Z, right? So they have a need to contribute, and they have this again this momentum, and they have a kind of inherent wisdom, but what they lack is having those wisdom containers and frameworks, and this is where we can help them. So, in other words, we need adolescents and they need us. And I think rituals are a very, very important way, historically, culturally, but also cognitively, to make sense out of things and to create meaning. These they don't have to be like self-mutilation, but I will give an example from my practice. So again, when I work with teenagers, there were often those moments where I encouraged my teenagers to roast me, to really, I gave them permission to roast me. Like, for example, when we're at in psychiatric hospital, like an inpatient setting, and you meet at, I don't know, lunch and so on, and then I really gave them the permission to roast me, but I told them then I will roast you too. And what happened there is this took away all the pressure, the internally built pressure. And I know I might get criticized of that behavior, but again, I stand behind it. So that because it was an act of this roasting was an act of goodwill. And it was some kind of love language as well. It's like a deep appreciation, a relational appreciation. And it was also a symbol for not to take ourselves too seriously. Now, what then happened, Frank, what often was these reciprocal acts of goodwill and gestures often turned into full-blown rituals. And rituals are exactly what's needed to regulate emotions. That's a very pragmatic aspect and function of it, but also important to cultivate or give us existential orientation and cultivate meaning in life. So I think rituals are definitely one aspect of that. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I want to broaden this discussion a little bit. I've been very curious. I mean, just from when I looked into you a bit, I was like, oh yeah, I've since being an adolescent, I haven't asked all of these questions that I'm always asking, and you know, we on Mindform are having these conversations. The conversation of this in the context of adolescence hasn't come up, and I thought, oh, that's a gap, and I think for a lot of people, it might be useful to reflect on adolescence with the mind of, oh, what are the things I was needing, etc. at that time. I think a lot of us in growing up, we're trying to move past that and as quickly as possible. But I do want to broaden this conversation of, you know, bringing gentleness and curiosity to the behaviors that we're wanting to change, or the heavy emotions we're wanting to not experience. You know, that's part of the conversation we've had. We've had this conversation of there's meaningless and there's existential questions, and how do we address that? So let's take that out into the world of all ages, right? The culture at large, not just adolescents. What, maybe I'll start with, what is meaning, right? What is meaning, the experience of meaning or meaningfulness to you, and what role do you want that to be playing in how we talk about mental health and how we try to solve our personal struggles?
Yeah. Yeah. I might be a little bit radical in that approach, in my views and
Exciting.
beliefs with regards to meaning. I think meaning is something very real, and modern people tend to reduce real to only if it has a material form or body. I think meaning is really real, and our need for meaning is really real. And basically, and this is where I quote my friend and colleague John Vervaeke here, who talks a lot about meaning and the meaning crisis. And basically, also when you look into that notion of meaning from a scientific perspective, when people talk about meaning, they use it as a kind of metaphor, like how a sentence is meaningful,
Mm-hmm.
right? And just as we use language or utter a sentence or create a proposition, it gives us truth about something, and that truth of the truth statement can connect us to the world. So basically, the lived experience, we use meaning as a metaphor in a way that we use meaning in sentences. It's a metaphor to connect to something. And the dimensions of meaning in life are basically what is called in the literature, it's called purpose, which I don't like the term purpose because it's we have this purpose culture, which is again this very, very driven, status driven kind of thing, like, oh, I have to have a goal and then another goal and blah, blah, blah. And I think goals often, as real as they are, they can also very frighten people. I rather think of purpose as some kind of horizon, and I think the better word would be orientation. So orientation and purpose is an aspect of meaning in life. Now the other one would be coherence. And coherence is when things start to make sense, right? When we make sense out of things, when those aha moments come in, when things start to click, when things start to fall into each other like like a puzzle or something that clicks, right? And then you get this aha, now I got it, now it makes sense. And often, for example, in trauma, what happens often in trauma is that the autobiographical coherence gets disturbed, and then you get into a kind of loop, temporal loop. And what you do often in therapy is you really lay out that narrative structure to create, again, coherence between you and your past self and future self, but also relating to the world. So coherence is a huge aspect. How coherent things are is a very, very good proxy for how meaningful our lives are. Now, this is one aspect. Another aspect is called mattering. When things start to matter to us and we start to matter to the world. And there is this huge need for, you can call it self-efficacy, but I think that doesn't really capture it. It's what is meaningful to me, what matters to me is an indicator of what is most real. And can I contribute to that? How is my relationship to what is most real? And this is captured by this dimension called mattering, which is really important. You see, even in that sentence, when I say it's really important, I try to highlight the dimension of mattering. Now, the fourth one would be connectedness. And this can be different kinds of connections that we are creating. It can be the connection inside, for example, to my parts or to myself, but it can also be the connection to socially to other people, or even the connectedness towards something ultimate, maybe sacred. And often when people say my life is meaningful, they say something, or I feel spirituality. What they mean is I am part of something bigger. There's the self-transcendent element to it. And I think this is what people often mean when they talk about meaning in life. And we're not talking about the meaning of life, which is more a metaphysical question. I'm talking about meaning in life. Now, the problem in psychology is that is often reduced to something subjective, which I think is a huge mistake, because meaning is something normative. There's this normative dimension about meaning. I admire you when you're having meaning in life, right? This is something I aspire to as well. Then, so it has this normative dimension, and in modern psychology often reduces meaning to just the subjective factor, and it makes us, oh, this is my meaning, and this is your meaning, and this is your meaning, and although there is no real connection between that, but no, that's not true. There is actually shared experience, and this is what I think my understanding of meaning points towards. It tries to transcend those notions of happiness and well-being and morality as well, and point towards more shared sense of meaning making and sense making and connection. Yeah.
Yeah, I see the connection, I suppose, between all of those definitions of meaning, and it paints a whole picture that probably understandably is very hard to articulate, because you're using the language of language, the meaning of meaning, to try to put words to it. But this, I understand what you say when you say that it's real, right? Because it is. I think it's easy to interpret meaningfulness as, our capacity to apply an idea to something, or something like that. But it's a whole. I suppose it describes the relationship between a whole self, and what is a self? A self is the way you orient, the interpretations you have of things, the things you value. Um, it's a way of describing the relationship, and that's a functional thing that has physical, real implications. The relationship between a self and the world around them. And when meaning is true, and when meaning is real, it's not just um, a description of that relationship, but in describing that meaning, you're actually describing the reality of how an individual is a participant in and part of this interconnected whole.
Yeah.
And the objects in our world. Yeah, I do find it funny how in our sort of reductionist culture now, I suppose we see isolated objects as real things, and the world is maybe a list or a collection of isolated objects. But nothing happens, and none of these objects could be understood or comprehended or exist or have meaning if it's not for the interactions between objects, right? The interaction between self and other, or between self and environment, or the way we understand the interaction between this. That's how we know what something is, right? It's how it relates to the whole. So I
Exactly.
see where you're coming from in terms of the absolute necessity of appreciating and understanding how much meaning one's experiencing how one is experiencing meaning, in order to understand, okay, what is the world they live in? How do they relate? Is it a functional way of relating to the world or not? How do we facilitate meaningfulness for people? How does one develop that? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was recently at a conference for systemic family therapy in Lyon, in France, and there were beautiful contributions to that. And I've attended a workshop by Åse Holmberg, who is a Norwegian professor and studies basically spirituality. And I actually want to introduce her ideas, if that's okay. So I
Of
think it
course.
starts by acknowledging our own spirituality and meaning, and it really makes space and room. That's the term she uses, and to really develop what she calls spiritual literacy. And it means, she doesn't mean to be, what she says is, well, we need to become bilingual. And when she says bilingual, she doesn't mean we need to know all the content of various world religions. That's not what she's talking about. But adapting a language of the people that we meet, of our interlocutors, that makes a dialogue around these topics possible. And we can only talk openly in dialogue if we can acknowledge our own spirituality and disclose them. Because how often do even psychologists, right, feel the need to hide and deny their own spirituality because they think that that makes them, I don't know, less serious or less evidence-based or less enlightened? I would say the best way to cultivate that is to open a space, uh, a courtyard of dialogue. This is what John Viveki calls it, where we really can invite conversations around that and see where we converge, but also where we may differ. And I think spirituality meaning is best lived when it's embodied, right? It's how often have I seen people taking that kind of road and bypassing a lot of stuff, like this typical spiritual bypassing road, and when it's not really enacted and embodied. And I think meaningfulness can be done again in a very gentle and light and very concrete fashion, like small daily acts of service, small
Mhm.
tasks to contemplate. For example, um, I share personal experience and with my clients at times, or there's also self-disclosure there. Of course, not too much because I don't want to hijack the conversation, but I try to make a case human for this deep human need for meaning. And for example, what I do is I give my university students, I give them practices, or I give them contemplative writing exercises where I ask them, what were moments where you've really felt connected? And in that way, you can, like, as a byproduct, what emerges is the sense of meaning and spirituality without the formal need to address it, like directly, or to mention or to bother people with that kind of with that notion of spirituality and meaning, and to really, really create rituals, exercises, spaces where we can be with each other and witness each other. And I think, again, those small acts of service, all of them in an embodied sense, they can help us cultivate more meaning in life.
hmm hmm Is this a bit of what you are doing with the K7 Institute? As you're coming up with, whether it's questions or conversational toolkits or whatever it is, to bring conversations about meaning to people in a world where maybe we don't have as many conventions or institutions of how people can navigate those meaning
Yeah,
questions.
yeah. I think that's what we try to do is, um, so we, so my team and I, when I say team, I mean Ann-Kathrin Bockmann, my colleague and friend, dear friend and colleague and mentor, but also Tamara Thomsen, also my dear friend and colleague, and she's a professor um, as well. What we I think what clicked for us is that we can only tackle these global crises when we create more social cohesion. This is the term that Harvey Whitehouse uses, an anthropologist, I think from Oxford, who does wonderful job on that. And basically, his body of literature, a body of research shows that we can only tackle those global crises when we create more social cohesion, which is like social glue, the connectedness we're talking about, basically.
Mm.
And I think we really care about creating more connectedness. So the K7 Institute, and we try to do it from a very, very, in a very local manner, but also in a very global manner. Um, having different kinds of projects, like the Layla projects, um, where we've done work with refugee mothers in the Middle East, or um, educating the Violence Prevention Center in Hamburg, right? And cultivating practices so they can connect better at schools, like using IFS models adapted outside of psychotherapy into areas and realms like school context, for example. So we are really into bringing these kinds of different practices, and especially the focus on parts work, and to relate to ourselves better using IFS into these different kinds of areas inside of psychotherapy and outside of psychotherapy, and really creating not only material, but also programs and practices and trainings and workshops and lectures to really foster that. And I think that's the main objective and rationale and goal of that K7 Institute. And it's so much fun. It's so much fun working with these very like-minded people. And I think that's the through line. There is it again, lightness and fun, and taking serious the the meaning crisis that we are in, but also not being, mm, but also creating agency around that so that people don't feel powerless, so they can actually tackle the meaning crisis and solve it. And I think that's That's at least what I try to bring into that institute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the reconciliation of that tension people feel between taking things seriously and lightness is that I think we have a very, very urgent and serious obligation to enjoy life with lightness, and
Yeah,
it can be a light, fun, playful joy to take life seriously. That's the
absolutely.
those things don't need to be necessarily separate. What just could you help me by articulating exactly what it is that you're trying to create for people or give people access to with this institute? So you're bringing
Yeah,
IFS technologies, you're trying to facilitate connectedness, but what are you hoping people like walk away with from that?
yeah.
What ability or new perspective?
Mhm. So I think um, the function of that institute is diverse. Like again, we have a
Mm-hmm.
huge focus on research, where we actually do research or try to be part of research projects and contribute to that. But it's also another aspect of function would be to bring worlds together, to bridge different kinds of frameworks. For example, let's say the Mindform community with the IFS community, or with the,
Right.
I don't know,
Okay.
whatever kind of community, right? So to create more, again, to create a network, more connections. And because um, our hope there and our wish is there to tap into that collective wisdom and intelligence that we're having, the
Right.
distributed cognition. And this is one of the huge aspects, of course, but I also see clients in that institute. So I also do counseling, or we train psychotherapists or teachers or social workers or whatever, different kinds of professions in, for example, how to use IFS, how to cultivate meaning, how to make a case for adolescence and meaning and spirituality, and without it, without the necessity to sound like woo woo and stuff, and from a scientific um, perspective. So there are different kinds of functions that we that we cultivate and create, and different goals that we try to create and hit. So, and I would say um, we're really happy when we can create again more connectedness, and it can be a connection towards some kind of knowledge or new model, new insights, or new skills, but it can also be connections towards again communities and people. And when we are able to facilitate that, I think then we are quite fulfilled.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I can understand connectedness as an overarching term there, right? You want through this, you want there to be less isolated individuals, less isolated parts as well within individuals, right? And less, I think, because you understand the idea of how growth can happen through the parts
Yeah,
work, through the internal family systems process. It is building relationship and transference of knowledge and perspectives, right, between different parts of yourself. And through that, your coherence, you're able to bring
yeah,
all these aspects of yourself towards a shared intention and a shared goal.
yeah,
And the same thing can happen at the collective level, right? When you're sharing knowledge, when you're building relationship, and when you're encouraging these tools of curiosity, empathy, um, yeah, and kind of connecting at that deep personal spiritual level, then individuals across a group can come together with in the same way with coherence, right? With a shared intention and that
exactly.
positions people to solve broader problems. So it's a it's kind of it's fractal in a way, I suppose.
It is. It is
Same thing
fractal.
at
Yeah.
different levels. Yeah, awesome. Okay, well we've sort of reached the end of our time, Kasra. So maybe to wrap us up, could you
Mm.
just share from this conversation what is something you'd want to leave with the listeners? What's kind of a key insight you really want to get across to people, or a tool to bring this connectedness, this meaningfulness to bear on whatever people are struggling with?
Yeah. Yeah. I I guess I want to encourage people to not fall into despair, even though we might have plenty of reasons to. And I really want to encourage to tap into our agency and to that collective intelligence, while at the same time taking serious the reality of and the darkness around us that we are all confronted with. We are in a deep meaning crisis, yet I think the art is not to give into that despair. And if I can encourage people to leave with hope and aspiration and a vision, and help especially younger people not to fall into despair, that would be awesome.
Right. And maybe we need to, maybe what you're saying with helping each other, right? That might be necessary, but find the capacity to face, acknowledge, feel despair without falling into it. And
Yeah.
that's the
Even if
scary
it's
thing.
these small, even if it's
Yeah.
these small acts of services, like never underestimate the power of these small deeds. And I think this is something that everyone in the entire world can do. This is where our freedom and agency lies.
Beautiful. Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, Kasra, for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Frank. I enjoyed it really, really a lot.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to the Mindform podcast. I'm Ryan A. Bush, founder and author of Designing the Mind and creator of Mindform. Mindform is an exclusive community and training platform for sculpting your psychological software. Members get access to a group of like-minded psychotechs, including all of our guests on this podcast, gamified growth tools, events and retreats, and a collection of transformative programs for mental health and self-mastery. You can learn more and apply to join at mindform.io/podcast. I hope to see you inside.